Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to this second annual symposium of the Dutch Reproducibility Network. I see a lot of familiar faces, that's always nice, but it's maybe even nicer to see a couple of new faces. Welcome to new people as well. As the Dutch Reproducibility Network, we try to coordinate and facilitate initiatives for transparent and reproducible research, as you know, and today I think we have a great program which will show things or initiatives that are going on in the plenaries, in the workshops, but also at the poster sessions. So I'm really looking forward to everything. But first, for now, let me introduce Caspar Albers to you, who's going to open this symposium. Caspar Albers is Dean of the Faculty of Behavioral and Social Sciences. He's professor in applied statistics and data visualization. And his research focuses on the development of statistical models for the application in the social sciences. Further interests lie in science communication concerning uncertainty, for which data visualization plays a key role, of course, and also in improving scientific practice in general. Last but not least, he's also the current chair of the steering committee of the Open Science program in Groningen, so for the RUG and the UMCG together. And I can't think of anybody more fitting to open this symposium, so please give him a warm welcome. Caspar, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, welcome to beautiful Groningen for this second annual meeting of the Dutch Reproducibility Network, and especially warm welcome for everyone who had to get up quite early despite the weather to be here in time. Unfortunately, I can't stay here very long because in an hour I have a working group meeting where we need to think up creative ways to save millions and millions of euros because of the budget cuts. So also there lies a task for you. The more we can rely on open access, open source software instead of expensive commercial software, the more we can move to diamond open access journals instead of giving taxpayers money to Elsevier and Taylor and Francis. The less we need to cut on our own staff and students. So, of course, those budget cuts are a major threat to anyone working or studying here in this country, but at the same time also prove the importance of this movement. And this movement, of course, goes further than making things freely available, but it is a very useful kind of byproduct of doing things open. And also, if you look back at the past, say, 10, 15, 20 years, we can see that the open science movement has radically changed science. At our university, open access publishing rates are already almost 100%. And the university now also has its own open access book publisher. And words like replication studies, pre-registration are not some kind of code language for a small group of nerds anymore, but anyone at least knows about them. We're not there yet that anyone also uses them, but we're making really major steps towards a better and more scientific future. So that's really good. And as a spin-off of all these transparency and accountability aspects of these movements, universities also have taken massive steps forwards relating to recognition and rewards, team science and science communication. And so I really think it's not an exaggeration to state that the open science and replication movement has done more for science than any recent Nobel Prize winner you can come up with. So we can look back with pride of what the open science and reproducibility movement has achieved so far. And it's tempting to state, well, we have achieved so much, mission accomplished. Let's go on and do something else. But at the same time, we're not there yet. We've made massive improvements on open access, but we are still, as I just said, spending millions of taxpayers' money on Elsevier and the like. And every new tool that's being developed, we run the risk of new vendor lock-ins. Our education, at least at this university, most programs are still far from open education. And it's also very difficult to get rid of our addiction to proprietary software like SPSS, even though there are very good and free alternatives available. So to keep the momentum going, it's really vital to have meetings like this, and so it's also really good to see this massive turnout here today. And without initiatives, bottom-up initiatives like the Netherlands Reproducibility Network, progress in this field would reach a standstill. And the organizers have set up an amazing and varying program today for your pleasure and education. And I'm not only a chair of the open science movement, but as you already said, also a professor of data visualization. So in that role, I'm also especially interested in the first keynote talk by Tracey Weissgerber, because her 2015 paper on bar charts, even though it's less than 10 years old, is already one of the instant classics in the field of data visualization literature. So I really want to thank the organizers for setting up this program and want to wish you all a very educational day. Thanks.
Thank you, Caspar. Okay, just for those who have maybe had a quick look at the program, here's the entire program. So we'll start with the keynotes, and then have lunch and the poster session. I think we have some wonderful posters, so don't forget to visit them. And after that, we have 2 workshop rounds, or maybe 1 if you chosen the long one. A coffee break, and we'll close with a panel session, and also, of course, with drinks and bites. Now it's my pleasure to give the word to Tamarinde, who will chair the morning session. She's a member of our steering group, and I think she'll sort of explain what this session is about a little bit. Photos? Oh yeah, sure. That's a good thing. We will be taking some pictures for social media. If you don't want to be on them, please let us know. We'll take that into account. And then now, I give the word to Tamarinde.
All right. Thank you all again very much for being here. And Caspar already did maybe a more apt introduction of Tracey than I could do. We chose because the day today is also tailored around the topic of the future of reproducibility. And we want to invite you and open you to maybe think outside of the box and to think about what reproducibility could look like in the Netherlands, in Europe, in the world, maybe in 5-10 years at least down the line. And in order to promote all of us to think about that a little bit critically and informed by evidence, we have 2 fantastic keynotes for you organized. And we chose those keynotes very deliberately because they represent really different outlooks on the field, incorporating sometimes more historical aspects, incorporating maybe aspects that even hinge towards automated forms of screening. And I hope that that's going to inspire all of us, also in the discussions in the break, to think about what would this mean. And I think we're a beautiful turnout, but we're also a small enough community so that hopefully you feel invited to also connect with others and from unfamiliar faces that you haven't seen before. But without further ado, I would like to invite the first keynote to come up to the stage. And this is Tracey Weissgerber. Tracey at this point is the Excelsior Era Team Lead Chair at the University of Coimbra. She is both a physiologist and a meta researcher who's done tremendous work and is still working on improving data visualization, but also on methods to improve reusability more broadly, looking at protocols, looking at transparent communication around methodology, and all sorts of other factors that can promote reproducibility within the biomedical sciences. Tracey is also the working chair of the Screen IT group that curates a pipeline of automated screening tools. And I know her to be a very innovative teacher and also developer of various innovative teaching formats. So with that, Tracey, could I please invite you up on the stage and enlighten us? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I am delighted to be here, and I would like to thank Tamarinde and Michiel for inviting me to your beautiful city, and I'm really enjoying everything that it has to offer, including your lovely weather today. Okay, So I was asked to offer a biomedical perspective on the future of reproducibility. And many of you who are from the biomedical field will be aware that this is something that we have been discussing in biomedicine for quite a long time, although our ability to solve the problem is perhaps limited, which is why I'm excited to see so many of you here in the room today who are going to take on this challenge, and I'm sure we'll have it all fixed within a year or two. That's excellent. Okay, so there are many, many publications that started around 2010, 2012, highlighting the problems with reproducibility in the biomedical field, and there are similar publications coming out of other fields. I'll just highlight a few of these. So one is a very well-known publication from Glenn Begley and Lee Ellis, where they were looking at the reproducibility of studies coming out of academia that industry was trying to use to build drug trials on. And what they found was that a very low percentage of those animal studies could actually be reproduced, between 11 and 25%, which is not inspiring, which meant that industry was spending a lot of time validating these efforts coming out of academia before they could actually use them and start to make progress. There was also a survey done that indicated that more than half of researchers across many fields, has had trouble reproducing their own work or someone else's work in the field. And this led to a series of reproducibility projects, such as the Reproducibility Project in Cancer Biology, which planned to replicate many high-impact cancer papers and later found out they were unable to replicate many of them because the details needed to reproduce the studies weren't there. And of those that they did try to replicate, many of them also failed to replicate. And there are other similar efforts in other fields and other research areas. I won't go too much into the terms today. I'll simply say that there has been a shift in how the terms are used over time. There are many definitions, and what exactly definition you use will depend a little bit on your research field. But reproducibility now is generally referring to the ability to recreate the findings given the same data that the authors had, whereas replication is often referring to the ability to reproduce the results in an independent study. Okay, so why does this matter, and why does it matter specifically in the biomedicine field? Well, in biomedicine, the goal of scientific research is to provide an evidence base to improve patient care, to give our patients better treatments, to improve their health and their lifespan and their quality of life. And in order to do that, we need reproducible results that will help us to make informed decisions that can benefit patients and society. So when we're seeing many results that don't replicate, that means that it's unclear or likely that these results are in fact not translating into benefits for our patients, and we may be wasting resources, and we may also be exposing patients to risks in trials that then come back with no benefit for them. So it's important to think about why research isn't reproducible or replicable, and we might imagine three different classes of reasons. The first reasons might be things that are informative, that give us more insight into the biological questions that we're answering, or into the methods that we're using. So perhaps we learned that it doesn't reproduce because we had a slightly different patient population, because we are using a different method, and this gives us new information that's relevant to the biology or to how we design our studies. There might also be neutral or unknown reasons, so perhaps we don't know why a study isn't reproducible or replicable, or perhaps we learn that it's simply a matter of random variation. We don't always get the same result every time we do an experiment, and that's okay. But what's more concerning is the third category, the problematic reasons, the reasons that suggested that perhaps things aren't reproducible because there's a problem in the way that we conducted the science in the first place. Perhaps there were flaws in the study's design. Perhaps the researchers were using questionable research practices that increased their likelihood of generating spurious findings that were never really real to begin with, and hence they don't hold up and they're not reproducible. And this third class is a major issue because what we've learned in the ensuing years is that many of the problems related to reproducibility probably do fall into this third class of problematic issues, and hence the reproducibility crisis may be a manifestation of larger underlying problems that affect the quality of the research that's being conducted and the incentives and rewards in the system that is producing that research. So when we think about reproducibility and replication, these two concepts are inextricably connected to openness and transparency. In order to check whether something is reproducible, we need to have the data and good information about how that study was conducted. And so data and code are really crucial to determining whether a finding are reproducible. So it was mentioned by our introducing speaker this morning that the open access movement has been really crucial in transforming science. And I think it's important to think about how that is intersecting with the movement for reproducibility. So let's talk a little bit about the evolution of open research. So as Caspar mentioned, open research movement has really started with open access, with the idea that we are producing results from research that are supposed to benefit patients, that are supposed to benefit the public, that are funded by the public, and we need everyone to have access to those papers. And that includes the public, the research community, policymakers, everyone. And it was shared this morning that the open access rate for publications at this institution is 100%, which is excellent. From papers, we started to move backwards, in large part due to the reproducibility movement, to think about open data and open code or open software. And this fits very strongly with the theme of thinking about the results and the conclusions of the research. Are they reproducible? This is how we check. We get open data, we get open code, we rerun things to see if we can get the same results. And this effort has been greatly accelerated by the release of the FAIR Guiding Principles for Scientific Data Management and Stewardship, which think about how do we share data in a way that others can actually reuse them. And now we're introducing a different concept here, which is reuse. So we're not just thinking about using those data to make sure that the findings are accurate in the first place. We're also thinking about, can we reuse that data for other purposes to generate new findings? And as was highlighted by Caspar in the introduction, to reduce research waste and add value based on data that we've already collected. But there's a problem here that I want to highlight in this transition from reproducibility to reuse as we're thinking about open data and open code. So I'd like to do a thought experiment, and this experiment starts with me doing a very bad study. So it's a poorly designed study and it has a high risk of bias, but I'm really into open science, so I share my data for all of you to reuse in a fair and open way. And I do a great job of getting that data set up online in a way that all of you can reuse. And now we have a problem because we have this fair data that's available, but it's unlikely to yield trustworthy or reproducible findings. But because it's easy to get, each of you go and perhaps you uncritically reuse that data, and now we have a success because data were reused many times to generate new findings. However, if the reusers didn't or couldn't account for the design flaws that were in my original study when they did their analysis, the findings aren't likely to be trustworthy or replicable. And in the long term, this may not benefit society or science and may ultimately cause harm. So how do we prevent this from happening? Well, we need to remember that openness and fairness are important. They are indicators of quality, but they're not the only indicators of quality, and alone they are not markers of rigorousness, of trustworthiness, or of risk of bias. So the perspective of the reuser is a fundamentally different one. A researcher who wants to reuse data can't simply determine whether a data set is open and fair. They also have to consider the quality of the design that was used to generate or collect the data, and whether the data are appropriate to answer the secondary research question that they are interested in asking. And this is a topic that we've addressed briefly in a commentary that I've linked below. So what do we need to do here, and what is the future? Well, part of the future is to expand our approach by considering the responsibilities of the data reuser. So what we have are the FAIR principles, and those are outlining the properties of a data set that facilitate reuse. As such, they track very closely with the responsibilities of the person who is depositing that data, and they help us to answer the question, can I reuse this data? What we need are guiding principles for how to reuse data responsibly. And so these would be guiding principles that would outline the responsibilities of the person who plans to reuse that data. And they are going to answer a different set of questions. And those questions are, should I reuse this data? Does it make sense for my research question? Is it likely to give me trustworthy and reproducible results? And how should I use this data responsibly? And these are fundamentally different questions because they require much more detail, not about the data, but about the methods, about how the data were generated. Now, I'll pause here briefly because there are different types of areas in biomedicine. Some of you are working in very computational fields where your code is your method. And so in these fields, sharing code and sharing data are open science, and they are also reproducible research. Others work in fields where you have extensive methods and data connection techniques that are not built around code. And for these people, open science and reproducible research practices are quite different because there are so many methods that aren't captured simply by sharing code. Okay, so the evolution of open research. So we have open access, we have open data, we have code. What we're not thinking about nearly as much as we perhaps should be is open methods. And when we go towards open methods, we're now thinking much more about our research processes and our outputs, which is bringing us towards this concept of reusability and not only reproducibility. And I would argue that if we were thinking logically from the beginning, perhaps we would have started with open methods much sooner. Why are open methods so important, and why do we need a culture of sharing open and reusable methods? The first reason I would argue is that reproducibility and replication start with methods. So we cannot reproduce or critically evaluate findings without knowing how they were generated. We have to know how data were collected before we can reproduce experiments. The second is the value of reuse. So researchers may be much more likely to reuse or adapt your methods than your data, depending on your research field. Methods can be one of the most reusable and useful outputs that researchers create. So it makes sense to invest much more time in sharing high-quality methods. And the last point is the one that we just discussed. For those of you who are interested in fair data and data reuse, again, we cannot reuse data responsibly without knowing how those data were created. And I'd also like to emphasize that there are large communities built around open data and code, whereas open methods have attracted comparatively little attention. So one of the things that we're doing to address this is I recently led the writing phase of a European Commission Science for Policy report called ProMap, and this is on promoting reusable and open methods and protocols. And the objective of this report is to offer recommendations to improve the clarity of methods and reusable step-by-step protocols in life sciences preprints and papers. The guideline offers recommendations for 4 different stakeholder groups: researchers, researchers' institutes and departments, funders, and publishers and editors. And all of these groups need to work together to achieve the goal of having better clarity around our methods and our step-by-step protocols and more detailed and reusable methods. But the actions that each of them need to take, the levers they can push, the ways that they can work towards change are different, which is why we have different recommendations for each stakeholder group. Okay. While we're thinking about going backwards, there's one other crucial piece of the scientific process that we haven't discussed and we haven't really gotten into yet, and that is how we select and prioritize our research questions. And this is also a crucial step because when we're thinking about these very early phases of the research process, selecting our research questions, designing our studies, and then potentially sharing outputs that we create, those decisions that have massive impact on the potential impact of the research, the trustworthiness of the research, and the usefulness of the research to scientists and society are made very early in the process. So by the time we get to open data and open code and thinking about whether the results are reproducible, all of those opportunities have already been missed. And so what is the future of reproducibility? Well, I think it's in part about recognizing that we're not just having a conversation about reproducibility, we're having a larger conversation about research quality. And research quality has many different intersecting dimensions. So we started with reproducibility, but we found that very quickly we moved into reusability, into repurposing outputs to answer other research questions, to add value and reduce waste in research. We moved into openness and transparency. We also talked about themes like research rigor or scientific rigor. We might also think about other elements of quality like innovation or impact or the ethics and integrity of the work. And the challenge here is that when we focus on just one dimension, just reproducibility, we miss opportunities to improve research quality overall, and we also weaken our ability to collaborate with other disciplines and fields that might prioritize different aspects of quality. So for example, when we're thinking about open methods, there are social sciences disciplines where they don't expect results to be reproducible because a result cannot be separated from the researcher who reproduced it. That person is an integral part of the method. And so in those fields, it may be much more likely that we could have a conversation about the reusability of methods, about why someone would need to know about your methods so that they could reuse them in another context, as opposed to having a conversation about reproducibility, which isn't a priority for some researchers in those fields. Okay. So the provocative question I'd like to ask is working backwards through the research process to make our outputs more open really the best way to move forward? Because as we've seen, many of these fundamental decisions that affect the dimensions of research quality are occurring in the topic selection and the study design phase before we even collect any data. And if our goal is really to improve research quality overall, perhaps we should start from the beginning and opt for a holistic approach to improve all of the elements of research quality together instead of highlighting a single element. The other thing that's important here is changing rewards and incentives. So if we want people to share all of these different outputs, their data, their code, their software, their methods, their protocols, perhaps their educational resources and tools, then we need to actually incentivize and reward them for doing that. Because sharing these outputs takes time. It takes effort to do it in a high-quality way that others can reuse. And right now, we reward people primarily based on their publications and their grants. So if I share a publication with no other outputs, and Tamarinde shares a publication with her methods, her materials, her data, her code, and her software open, she has done far more work, but we are getting the same unit of credit. And that's not good for keeping people who are sharing the outputs that we want in the research system. So changing incentives is fundamentally important. I'm going to briefly discuss some other reasons why it's important to modularize our research outputs or to be linking out to all of these other outputs that we have in our research papers. So our open methods, our materials, our data, and our code to show how they contributed to the research and where other people can get details. So the reason this is so important, there are many. The first is that those other more detailed outputs are where someone who wants to reuse or replicate the study is going to find the details that they need to do it. Those details are missing from the papers. We know this from replication project after replication project where they've said we were unable to replicate because there weren't enough details in the paper for us to determine what needed to be done. The second is when we share outputs, we make it easier to find other things that someone might find useful. So for example, if I am using a particular method that Tamarinde might find to be useful in her research, but she's not interested in my research question, she might never read my paper and she wouldn't know about my method. But if we have search engines where we can go in and search for methods or data, it's much easier for us to search for relevant keywords for that method or for that data set that would bring us to outputs that we wouldn't find otherwise because we weren't interested in the person's results and their research questions. Finally, when we're thinking about reforming incentives, we need to make other outputs visible, because as long as they're invisible, it's very hard to change the rewards and incentive system to recognize something that we cannot see. It also allows us to adjust authorship to give credit to those who led or created other outputs. So the authors on your pre-registration might be different from the authors on your methods or your data set or your paper. And the order of authors might also be different because different people may have leading roles in creating each of those outputs. And when we do all of these things, we offer more than one path to being a successful researcher. So we have ways for recognizing our methodologists, for recognizing our study design experts, our data analysts, our statisticians on these different outputs that they have leading roles in creating, and it's easier for us to see the benefits of team science and the contributions of different individuals to those teams. So fixing the problem, one final note here is that we really need applied and solution-oriented meta-research to test what interventions work in which research contexts, and also to improve the quality of research as well as research practice and research culture. And I've just left logos here for the 3 consortia funded under the EU reproducibility grants, iRise, OSIRIS, and Tier 2, which will be hosting a workshop this afternoon to talk more about how these consortia are tackling the problem of building an evidence base for how do we intervene. We can propose as many suggestions as we want, but if we don't test those things and find out if they work, we are just wasting everyone's time. We're creating a lot of chaos in the system without providing good guidance about how do we move forward and how do we actually build a better scientific system. And these 3 consortia are now coming together to build a community to allow others to join who are passionate about improving reproducibility and other elements of research quality and really testing interventions systematically to build this evidence base. And we hope that some of you might be interested in joining that community in the future. So I will now do a couple notes that are not so relevant to my talk, but might, I hope, be of interest to some of you. The first one is that in Berlin in September of 22nd to 24th of 2025, we will be hosting a Responsible Research in Action conference. And the goal of this is to bring people together to work on 10 different projects that over the course of 2 days can produce deliverables to improve some element of research culture and practice. Right now, the proposal call is open, and we are looking for people, and especially early career researchers and young people, who have ideas for a project that they would like to run during the unconference. And so if you have an idea, I would encourage you to think about it, to perhaps develop your idea with a colleague, and go ahead and submit a proposal to us for a project that you would like to do and a team that you would like to lead. And if you're interested in coming to work on someone else's project while you're developing ideas for your own, registration for that will open later in 2025 once we have the project selected so that you can choose the project that you would like to join. And the second point is that, as Tamarinde mentioned, I've recently started a new position as the ERA Chair Team Lead for the Excelsior team in meta-research. And we do have a couple of open positions that will be coming up for a junior researcher and an assistant researcher. So if any of you are interested in shaping the future of a new meta-research team in Southern Europe, then I would encourage you to apply and think about joining us. The calls will be opening soon, and you can email the Excelsior email or myself if you have questions or would like to be notified when the calls open. So with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to welcome questions, comments, or emotional outbursts.
Thank you very much, Tracey. So the flow of the session is now going to be as follows. We have a brief, about 5 minutes for clarifying questions. And then I'll invite the other keynotes. They'll again get some clarifying questions just so you understand all the bits and pieces of their talk. And then we can have a bit of a more provocative, hopefully, general discussion. So with that, are there any questions for Tracey? And please maybe say who you are first so that the recording also has that data recorded. Thank you.
Hi, I'm René Bekkers from the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. I have a question on the modularization of research productivity, so to say. Could you comment on this from the credit taxonomy? Is the idea to basically identify each element in the credit taxonomy and then put that out as a product?
Tracey, please, could you?
Yes, sorry. I like to wander. It's very hard for me to be stuck behind a little box for the entire time. I mean, I think, so we have to think carefully about what the products are and how those differ across different fields and how they're shared. Credit, I think, was designed specifically for papers to recognize all the things that go in and make some of those contributions more visible. The modularization is another way of doing that because it allows us to use the authorship mechanism that we are familiar in the same way that we have been, to be offering additional resources and then to be encouraging people to cite those resources as they reuse them. Whether one also needs a credit style statement on each of these different outputs is, I think, a very provocative and interesting question to consider, and then how that how that credit authorship statement might look different for a protocol or a data set or a software tool compared to the types of categories that are included within the main credit authorship statement that it's intended to be included on the paper. Yes. Yes, that is the challenge of modularization. And I think it's important to recognize that every paper has different audiences, right? So there are the people that just want to know what you found, they want a high-level overview of what you did, and that's fine for them. But there are also the people that really do want the details about exactly how you did it because they plan to follow up on your work. And those are the people that are crucially important because they are your future collaborators, they're the future of your field. And so acknowledging their needs as well is a crucial part of how science advances.
Any other clarifying questions for Tracey? Well, I think you can take that as a compliment for your clarity. Thank you very much again. So we are now moving on to a very different field, and we actually have two people doing a combined keynote. Pieter Huistra is an associate professor of theory of history at Utrecht University. Pieter combines historiography and philosophy of history, and his research is concerned with historical epistemology and has as its central question, how does historical knowledge become true? Pim Huijnen also works at Utrecht University as a cultural historian, and his expertise is actually in digital history. And in the case of Pim, that includes the use of natural language processing and also artificial intelligence for the study of history, as well as reflection on how both digitization and the kind of datafication that we see in science, how that impacts also historical scholarship. And I have I'm going to invite you both to come up in a minute and to sat up here, and while I'll be moving this computer away temporarily. And the interesting thing is that despite these two gentlemen traveling all the way from Utrecht, that they actually both started their scientific career back here in Groningen. So we had a small little reunion this morning. But with that, please give me a sign as soon as I can start the screen. And thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I need the screen to see what it looks like. Yes.
Does this work? Okay. So thanks, Tamarinde, for the invitation and for introducing us. We're happy to be here. We'll talk about reproducibility in history and its benefits, but also its limits. So I think we can latch on to Tracey's talk at various points in our talk. And so we think that reproducibility should have a place in history, in our discipline, but also that we should see that that there are limits to its use. To explain that, let me go back to 2018, when there was a kickoff, you could say, in the discussion about reproducibility, replication, reproduction in the humanities in general. So already the timeline is different from what Tracey sketched. So the humanities were a bit late to the party, you could say. But I think it's important, I want to say immediately that this is not, what I'm trying to say is not, well, we don't want to present ourselves as lagging behind somehow, that we're catching up with the other disciplines. No, I think the big point that we're trying to make here is important to note that we do things differently. In the humanities, or at least for our own discipline in historiography, reproduction, replication, reproducibility mean different things and have different uses. So to give you an idea of this discussion, it was held quite uncommon for humanists in the columns of Nature, between, on the left, Rick Pils and Lex Bouter, who argued for a replication drive. And their idea was that the humanities were mostly empirical disciplines, just as other empirical disciplines, they should be subject to reproduction and replication. So that it's possible to replicate, as I quote them, replicate an original study to assess the likelihood that the original results are correct. So this, it's my guess that for many in the audience this would be a logical, not to argue with viewpoint, but for scholars from the humanities it's not so obvious to say that. And that immediately provoked a response or a call to resist this replication drive by Sarah de Rijke and Bart Penders. And what they said is that the humanities is different. They do different things. They pursue meaning beyond truth. So they do not seek the single truth, or they do not seek a single correct outcome, but rather they are engaged in a, you could say, a proliferation of interpretations. So an endless redoing, interpreting the same texts, the same events, the same people as well. So, and value does not lie then in getting the same outcomes, but getting different outcomes. I'll return to that in a minute. So it's an understanding of the humanities, it's also shared in historiography, as hermeneutical disciplines that revolve around the process of interpretation. And the goal here is to come up with interpretations that have, you could say, that have a representational or a metaphorical character of what has happened in the past, for example. Just to come up to some kind of representation or metaphor to understand what has been going on in the past. So that's a bit the starting point. I think we don't agree with either of these parties in the sense that the Pils and Bouten position does not take into account the specificity of humanities or historiography enough. But we do think that there is some use, or at least quite a bit of use, in trying reproducibility. So this will be the structure of the talk. First, to explain a little bit about reproducibility in history, what its problems are, then why we decided to give reproducibility a chance anyway, and then I will give the floor to Pim, who will then talk about what that entails practically. So what we learned when we started to reproduce historiography, and what that looks like, also by having a look at examples, and then we'll come back to some concluding remarks. So first, reproducibility in history. So as de Rijke and Penders also said, quality criteria are crucially different in the humanities and the sciences. So maybe reproduction works in the sciences, but it doesn't fit the quality criteria that humanists and also historians employ. What does that mean? Maybe to give you an idea that some things are quite uncommon, or some things in historiography are quite uncommon, or seem very far away or very far removed from current or even good practice in historiography. For example, pre-registration is something that is not being done, or on a very small scale in historiography. I see someone in the room, Hans, who did pre-register this study, but that's the only humanist I know who that did so. So this is not something that we do, and also it's not problematic because, tweaking your research design as you go, changing your research question, that's all fine for historians, right? If you come up with a negative answer to your research question, then you're a bad historian. Then you had the wrong research question. You should have adopted it to what you found. So it's not a disqualification. So as I guess in other disciplines, this would be very problematic if you would say things like that. So if, as a historian, the sources, as we call the stuff that we translate into data, the sources, if they lead you in another direction than you thought before, then that's fine. You have to follow that direction. Do not stick to what you did not pre-register before, but what you applied for in terms like that. But of course, but don't fear too much. It's not that we don't have any quality criteria around. So we also do things. So there are norms. For example, of course, yes, everyone knows there is peer review. So if you submit, I'm sorry. Is it law? Peer review is. I mean, it's also a very recent phenomenon, but we could talk about that also. Yeah, okay, but so yeah, of course, testing the quality of an article, judging the approach, how it's executed, but also the relevance, the originality of a study are also very important criteria to judge whether scholarship is good. There's historiographical debate, as historians call it. So the ongoing discussion between historians working on the same topic that historians have to take into account when they write new articles, new books. And as such, they assess continuously each other's work, you could say. And of course there are footnotes, right? So this is the hallmark of the historian or historical scholarship, is the fact that you use, of course, your footnotes. And what they offer, and this is what we think that what they offer, is some element of traceability, right? The footnote points you to a place where you could find the information that backs up your claims. So they offer traceability and reproducibility, so some extent of reproducibility as well. At least that's what we thought. For us, these footnotes were something of an invitation, you could say. So if historians give footnotes, then there's an invitation, follow me. You can see where I got this from. So in that sense, follow me looks like reproduce me to some extent. So that's the invitation that we, in the end, decided to accept. So, but how did we get there? Maybe some clarification on what we understand by reproducibility. This is copies some of what Tracey said, but I will add something to that, I think, as well. So we drew up this table to make a distinction that we borrow from Rick Bales, who wrote quite a few articles on this, between conceptual replication, direct replication, and reproduction. And if we look at conceptual replication, then would be to redo an original study only with the same research question, but with different primary sources and a different method. Direct replication would be same research question, same method, but different sources, different data. And reproduction then would be to redo the original study in its entirety, to really follow what the original historian had done in their original study. But what is different in any replication is the person of the scholar or the person of the historian who performs this study. And this is important for us. So even if you would reproduce your own work, of course, you would not be the same scholar as you were when you did this the first time, right? Because you're then the scholar who already performed the research, so then you're in it differently. And this is important. Of course, this is the case for any reproduction or replication. But this is important, as I said, because historians, most of them, not all of them, see themselves engaged in a hermeneutical discipline, the process of interpretation. And this process of interpretation is a very subjective, deliberately subjective process for which you need a subject, because if you don't have a subject, you cannot interpret. That's where interpretation starts from. So the subject is the left column, and that is different all the time. So this immediately implies, this subjectivity implies that outcomes will probably be different. We discussed this over breakfast. We don't know how different it would be if you let two historians do exactly the same research, but we guess it's different, depending upon age, ethnicity, gender, training, etc. And this would not disturb historians in any way, right? This would not be disturbing in a sense. This is where a lot of historiographical innovation and historiographical discussion comes from, the fact that people with different backgrounds ask different questions or ask the same questions but give different answers to them. So yeah, that's important to note. Then if we can make a distinction between replication and reproduction in terms of the goals that they aspire to achieve. So if you look at replication, both conceptual and direct, is epistemic consolidation, in the sense that the expectation between replication is that if you ask the same question, then you should come to the same results, right? So the process of replicating, the process of replication should lead to the outcome of a replication. That's true for reproduction as well, but as I keep that what I just said in the back of your mind, that for historians it would not necessarily be a problem if you would get to different outcomes if you to the same research question. But the goal of reproduction is not only epistemic consolidation, but also quality control, because what you do is actually checking what the earlier scholar, what the earlier historian has done by retracing the steps very specifically. So you're also looking at the quality of the original study. Did the original historian work in a transparent way? Was it an adequate way? Is it a plausible way how they worked? We can see now, to come back to these norms that we have, or these practices that historians have to ensure quality, is that the historiographical debate looks an awful lot like the like a conceptual or direct replication. So in the sense that you have a question like what caused the First World War? So this has been, since August 1914, this has been on the minds of historians. And they have been debating that endlessly, and they have maybe had the same research question, but they adopted for all kinds of different approaches: a political historical approach, economical historical approach, cultural historical approach. They come up with all kinds of different sources. First written diplomatic sources, then they added visual sources, then they added material culture, etc. And you can go on endlessly. So that looks a lot like same research question, different methods, different sources, right? So it looks like conceptual and direct replication. But here also, this is what historians cherish, and they say, it's a famous saying among historians, that the historiographical debate is an argument without end. And that's what it's supposed to be. It should never end. It should continue endlessly. Also, we would lose our jobs, of course, if we would end this argument. This is the idea that, again, you need an extra interpretation to make it rich, to make the historical discipline richer, to make our understanding richer. So here we're at a completely, we're going in a completely different direction, I think, from what other sciences would look for. So if historians would reach closure at some point, then we would be in trouble in this kind of debates. So okay, that's about the historiographical debate. But then I already said these footnotes, and then I think I can pass on to you, Pim. Of course, they were the invitation. So they say the historians are traceable, or in principle are reproducible. So yeah, let's move on to practice.
Exactly. Thank you. Because that is what we did. Pieter and I, together mostly with students and graduate students, we started reproducing existing historical scholarship in a project that we did, in a course that we taught, and in different contexts. So again, this is quite uncommon in our field, to reproduce an existing study. But yeah, we had no idea what would happen. So we first had to figure out what it is that we're doing in the first place. That is what Pieter just shared with you. And what I would like to share with you are some examples, or is to show you what we came across and what that meant for us. So to start with some examples, we've chosen these because these are very typical examples. I would like to stress, this is not at all uncommon. And what do I mean with this? Well, the example on top, it's on news media in early 20th century United States, and how ordinary people, how they find their news, how they found public information, how they dealt with that. And this article contained sentences like, that this information came from the weekly newspaper, which then probably proceeded to sit on the kitchen table for most of the week, to be leafed through at odd moments of the day, meant that in getting such information, one also got basic national and regional news. So what the author does here is invoking the past, right? You see before your eyes that kitchen table and a newspaper laying on it, and people doing their daily business, and sometimes, like the author says, leaf through the newspaper and in that way getting information. It could very well be, right? It could also very well not be, but that's what the probably says. But this is what historians do. So history is not stating one fact after the other, right? The history is invoking the past, doing something with these facts, writing a narrative of how it could have been in the past. The other example is how historians sometimes, not always, it differs very much, but deal with method. Close discursive analysis of the sources can uncover the reason for this well, yeah, and then the author goes to the research question. This is the method section of this paper. Close discursive analysis. That's what it is. So we learn about data selection. This author went to the archives and came back with a selection of source material. But what the author did with that is, yeah, we really don't find out other than close discursive analysis. Again, this is not at all uncommon. Historians who read this, and after all, these are published articles. These stories went through peer review. So this is very much accepted. Historians read this and think, okay, yeah, makes sense. I would have done the same, probably. At the same time, we learn nothing about how exactly the data has been analyzed. Getting back to what Pieter said before, doing reproductions in history, we find out we probably, or we can only do in one particular direction. Our guess is, well, the ordinary, if there is an ordinary way of doing reproductions, would be to start from the research question, to take the exact same data, to use the exact same methods, and then see whether you get the same results and come to the same conclusions. In history, that is quite impossible for the reasons that Pieter already mentioned. We live from different interpretations. So the best thing that we can do is to start with the conclusion, to start with the claims. Okay, this is where the author ended their analysis. These are the conclusions they reached. And can we now, that would then be the reproduction, can we now, given these interpretations, these results, see how the author came there? So it's what we call a minimal reproduction, working back, so to say, from the conclusions, from the results, to see whether all the steps back down to the selection of the sources, the methods, and the research question is retraceable, is transparent in some way. This is the best thing that we can do, we think, in history, but at the same time, and for the reasons that I just mentioned in these examples, it's not straightforward. History is an academic field. Let me stress that again. Right? And we have quality criteria. History is also a beautiful field that results in a lot of compelling analyses, but it's also a lot is also done very implicitly. So these are the things that we came across when doing these reproduction, and I'll go into one particular example in a second. But it's, yeah, historians do use a lot of implicit codes and norms, intransparent methods of the sort that I showed before, intransparent about data selection. It is most of the time clear what a scholar has used, but not at all what they didn't use. Historians go to the archives, come back with a selection of sources, but what the author, what the researcher has seen but hasn't used, for whatever reason, that is not very obvious. Historians use footnotes, and a lot of them, but we haven't done a reproduction, we, as in Pieter and I, or our students, without coming across vague or failing footnotes. So where an author makes a specific claim and references a book, so to say. Here's the book where you can find this claim, and look up for yourself where you can find it. Things like that. Cherry picking. And what we noticed is a lot of implicit appeals to authority. So what we did, that's one of our lessons, or why we started doing reproductions in the first place was partly really to discover how our own field actually works. What do historians do when they, when they do their scholarship? And when thinking about what to reproduce, what studies to look into, one of the first things that we said was, well, yeah, we have to pick high-level articles. So we have to learn from the best examples. So let's start with the best professors and their publications and see how they do that. But that was not always a good choice, because the higher, the more authoritative professors were, often the less transparent they were. The more they appealed to their own authority. Say, yeah, well, you know me, I know what I'm talking about, so I don't have to reference everything. That's quite typical, and I'm really curious to learn whether this is something unique to our field or whether this is something that you recognize. I talked about invoking the past. Yeah, that is our strength. That is what historians do. That is what we're good at, and that's very valuable for our field. But it's also, by nature, almost, hard to combine with norms for reproducibility. Yeah, it simply has these appeals to the imagination as a consequence. You cannot put everything in footnotes, in things that you can make transparent. What historians also do is a lot of argumentation by example. If you're very negative, you can call that cherry picking, but cherry picking also, maybe for that reason, is not a concept that historians are familiar with. We know that the study of history is trying to cope with the sparse information that is left from the past. So, yes, almost by definition, we have to do with the small number of examples of information that is left for us. So what do I mean with that? Here's an example of a reproduction that we tried. We never, to be clear, reproduced an entire study. That's too much for how we went about. We stick to, in this case, one paragraph, one argument. But this is the entire article. It's called Imagineering, or What Images Do to People, Violence and the Spectacular in the 17th Century Dutch Republic. We selected it because it was one of the most well-read articles of a high-tier journal called Cultural History, written by not one, but a number of professors, well-known professors from the Netherlands and Belgium. Central claim of this article was that the 17th century Dutch Republic saw a shift in how people related to violence, how or what role violence played in people's lives. And this shift, they coin a term to bring the shift into words, and they call it Imagineering. A shift brought about, they say, in their claim, by a rapidly developing consumer market and by administrations who made less use of the public display of violence. This shift, they say, caused a regime change. Because before the shift, there was a theatrical culture of public spectacle, or a theatrical regime. After the shift, there was a spectacular culture of private consumption, or a spectacular regime. Again, and that's the reason why I show you this is very typical for how history works. To talk in terms of regime, which is used almost interchangeably with, as you can see, with culture. So there cultures exist, regimes exist, shifts and processes exist that we can give names like Imagineering. This is what historians do. It's very typical. It's also, and also for us, it was kind of mind-blowing. What exactly are they saying here? I mean, on some level, it's very clear, right? If you think about how we, for example, digest news, right? There has been a shift in recent decades. In the 90s, news came to us through newspapers and the television, and that's not the case anymore. That's not how most of us read the news, right? Not through television and newspapers. So you can say, yeah, okay, there was a shift, and you can give this shift a name, of course. So at some level, yeah, this is something similar, it makes sense. But if you really look into it, you think, yeah, why do they call it at the same time a regime and a culture and a process and a shift? And what exactly is their point here? And then I said nothing about how they actually argue, what their arguments are, how they substantiate their claim, because that's what they do by comparing to the works of two artists, in this case, de Hooge and Callot, who have made a number of prints, and they say, and this resembles, I think, very much the quote that I gave before about the newspaper lying on the table, much more than Callot's theatrical scenery, de Hooge's work makes one hear the cries of children and the grunts of slaughtered pigs, feel the heat of ignited fires, and smell the odor of roasting human flesh. Yeah, it's very nicely written, right? And okay, it does its work. Is it convincing? Well, yeah, that's up to you, I guess. Right? This is an example they gave of these prints. Again, quite typical, and it's quite easy to ridicule an article like this, again written by very well-known professors who are, well, yeah, we know most of them who are actually very good scholars, right? So yeah, so it makes it difficult, right? What is going on here? We think, well, yeah, two things at the same time. This is the status of the reproducibility of history, but also this is what historians do and what they should do, because yeah, if we turn our field into an absolutely reproducible field, we cannot do things like these anymore. We cannot interpret data, source material like this. We cannot write formulas like I showed you in the previous slide again, or not anymore. And that is what we like to do, and that is also, we think, how historians should work in some way. What did we learn? For the sake of time, I'll keep it brief. This is something that we can talk about to some more extent during the discussion. Reproductions in history will not give epistemic certainty for different reasons, but among others for the reasons that Pieter already mentioned. There are different interpretations. There is no objective judge that can say, well, your interpretation is the true one and yours doesn't make sense. What did we learn is how historians argue. And this is something that was new to us, right? Because, well, yeah, we're trained as historians, and that training also includes training in methodology, right? It's not just that historians simply do things. No, we have a formal training in how sound historical scholarship is done. Still, yeah, a lot of things that we found here were new to us. So this is, if you look really closely, so this is what historians actually do, and it was really insightful for us, including how transparent these arguments are and not. So what we learned was also a new way of reading, a way of reading that can be quite frustrating because, well, yeah, as I've showed you in the Imagineering example, if you read really closely, sometimes you don't know what you read anymore. But still, and that's something that we say a lot to each other, since we've done this, yeah, we read historical publications in a new way and in a more interesting way, a deeper way, you could say. Let me come to our conclusions. So from doing these reproductions, we learn what sound historical scholarship is in the first place. Because, again, these examples are published, right? These are accepted historical narratives. So that's what you can be sure of. So what you know is, okay, yeah, this is how it should be done. And then in the next step, these reproductions, they teach us, yeah, but how do they then function? What do they do in the first place? What we also think is that this notion of reproducibility can, for exactly this reason, be really, really helpful in history and probably in the wider humanities as well, because it makes you more precise as a reader, but also as a scholar yourself. Since we've done this, Pieter and I, that's also something that we say a lot to each other. Yeah, we're much more aware of how transparent we should be. And for this reason, we think that reproducibility should be a part of the training of historians, maybe has a place in, should have a place in scholarship with its own journals, which is not the case at the moment. But in this case, we think it's really, really helpful, although, and with that, I give the floor back to Pieter for the final slide, although full reproducibility is not attainable, nor, we think, desirable.
Yeah, so one more minute. Now for the final slide, so the limits of reproductions. There are obvious benefits that Pim just mentioned, and also clear limitations, and the fact that some have been mentioned already. So reproductions are in no way epistemically conclusive. So if you have a study and a replication, then you have two studies and you have not solved an epistemic problem, so to say. But there's also a thing that points also to what Tracey said, I think, about good or bad data. So there's a limitation in reproduction that things fall outside of what you can do within a reproduction. So you can only reproduce the study that has actually been performed. You're not reproducing the study that should have been performed, right? So a scholar can produce a perfectly reproducible study, right? But using the wrong or too little sources or something like that. So you could have a very reproducible study, but it could be a very bad study as well. And and I think it's important that so there's also that not all reproducible scholarship is important, but also, and Pim points this, and I want to reiterate this a little bit with a different example, that not all important scholarship is reproducible. So, you know, we had a bit of an issue with this article of Imagineering, right? So we're not really, I mean, it was a frustrating experience for me as well, the theatrical, the spectacular, etc., and the shift, the cultures, regimes, etc. So the slipperiness. But it is indeed what Pim said, this idea of pointing out, so not just listing up images, but pointing out that there are regimes or that there are cultures is exactly what historians do, that they make this interpretation, that they make the representations. So, for example, think about one of the most important, let's say, of these representations in 20th century historical scholarship, especially in German history, is the idea of the German Sonderweg. So the idea that Germany, of course you know German 20th century history, it needs explaining, right? So the explanation here is that Germany, and somehow as a nation, took a different path that led it into totalitarianism, to put it really shortly. So it went down its own Sonderweg, as it's called. But of course, that is an interpretation of an enormous amount of events, an enormous amount of sources. It requires an enormous leap, right? It's not that something that you can see from parliamentary records that you can say, now we can decisively conclude that we have a Sonderweg taking place. But this is very important and very good scholarship in the sense that it has ignited a lot of scholarly debate, gave a framework for many, many historical works, and also had enormous societal consequences in the way Germany acted. So it was also, as a nation acted, so it's also very important historical scholarship. This is what historians are supposed to do, but it's hardly reproducible in that sense. So reproducibility fits best with a certain way of knowing, and to borrow a phrase from the historian of science, John Pickstone, that you have different ways of knowing. So a statistics-based way of knowing that we know very well, I think, from the recent social sciences and recent biomedical sciences, is something that aligns very well with the notion of reproducibility. But what we're trying to say is that there are more ways of knowing, and if you focus on reproducibility only, then of course you limit yourself as well. So that's what we have been trying to say. So I think that's the end. And yes, you can read our white paper. Yes. So thank you for your attention.